In a direct full of downplayed and ignored games, I don't think there was anything more downplayed and ignored than Fatal Frame 2 Remake. Back in the day, Fatal Frame was seen as the third best horror game franchise, only behind Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and it's had a pretty solid history of horror releases. In fact, in the 2010s, it was considered the last true pure horror game franchise because the other two had fallen off into action game territory a long time ago. Fatal Fame has had a really interesting past decade with just some of the strange decisions that have happened with this IP really need to be discussed and talked about because one of the most interesting things about this is that this is a Nintendo IP. That's right. Fatal Frame is now owned by Nintendo and has been since 2008. But wait a minute. I thought this was coming out on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, the real gaming platforms. Well, my ignorant friend, Nintendo co-owns the IP with Koei Tecmo, and they have come to a sort of agreement in regards to the IP. Fatal Frame 4 and 5 had a ton of issues in development and during the release cycle because so many fans were upset at the console exclusivity. So many people thought that Nintendo, the kitty company, would ruin Fatal Frame and just discredit this entire franchise. And as a result of that, never really tried Fatal Frame 4 or 5. Fatal Frame 4 never left Japan, and Fatal Frame 5 was a digital only release in North America. So, ever since Nintendo acquired the IP in 2008, we have seen this obsessive, weird, conspiratorial community around Fatal Frame. People are accusing Nintendo of casualizing the games. They are accusing them of censoring the games. They are accusing them of making the games worse or getting in the way of the developer's vision or what have you. There is this massive conspiracy to try and paint Nintendo as doing something wrong with the Fatal Frame IP. And if you were there when Fatal Frame 5 launched on Wii U in 2015, you saw firsthand how many people were rapidly trying to downplay this game. One of the controversies that comes to mind, just one of them, is the whole censorship debacle, in which people accused Nintendo Treehouse of censoring a game that they actually didn't have anything to do with localizing. So, in short, every new Fatal Frame game, every new Nintendo exclusive was wildly hated by everyone for simply daring to be Nintendo exclusives. And so the IP stagnated, nobody bought them, and so we haven't seen a new Fatal Frame since Fatal Frame 5. So Nintendo seems to have allowed the series to have multi-plat releases simply to just stop people from obsessively downplaying all of these Nintendo versions of games. Nintendo still owns the IP. They have not sold it. Koei Tecmo has not reclaimed it. They still own the rights to it. They still own the exclusivity rights. But they have allowed these games to go multi-plat because they keep failing because the fan base keeps spurging out over what Nintendo's involvement. And that has led to the re-releases of Fatal Frame 4 and 5 to not have the same kind of overly obsessive downplaying that the games got on their original initial Nintendo exclusive releases. By making the games go multi-plat, Nintendo has kind of protected themselves from the core criticism of their era of ownership, that they are Nintendo exclusive. I have seen some speculation that Nintendo has lost their ownership rights of Fatal Frame and that Koei Tecmo has full control, which is why it's gone multi-plat. But I think we can disregard that as a theory, because if you look back over the past several Fatal Frame announcements, the re-release of 4, 5, and this new remake of 2, you can see clearly that each and every one of them was first announced at a Nintendo Direct. Now, immediately you have people on Twitter going out and like confirming that, like, well, these games are multi-plat, but they are still getting Nintendo releases. This isn't like Soul Calibur 2 HD, where Namco put out the far less popular Xbox and PlayStation 2 versions instead of the far superior GameCube version, because those were the consoles they wanted to support. Fatal Frame is still on Nintendo platforms, but because they're multi-plat, the entire core reason that a significant chunk of the fan base hated these games has been dealt with. And so we don't nearly see the same kind of backlash and rage towards them as we used to. And considering Fatal Frame 2 Remake is an entirely new remake of Fatal Frame 2, it seems as if Nintendo is positioning themselves to make a new Fatal Frame and make that one exclusive. And considering just how the past couple of Fatal Frame releases have been on Nintendo consoles, even if not exclusive, there won't be nearly as much backlash to their involvement as there has been traditional. So what ends up happening is that people are actually talking about Fatal Frame again. They are actually being positive about it. They are excited about the remake. They are excited about the ports. Now, they are excited about these games for the wrong reasons, but what ends up happening is that Nintendo is playing their hatred and contempt for the company against them. Because the more people that get into these games, once these games finally transition into being proper Nintendo IPs, suddenly there won't be nearly as much backlash as when Nintendo secures this as an exclusive IP again. We saw something similar when Bayonetta 2 was confirmed for the Wii U, but in a lot of ways, this entire situation has been worse because Bayonetta kind of became a meme with how vocal the developers were about how much Nintendo did for the company and how adult it was and how they encouraged them to do whatever they want. You know, Bayonetta 2 became a huge hit on Wii U and became this huge success, which led to a successful sequel and a spin-off game. And, you know, if it wasn't for Platinum dropping the ball the way they did, they would be one of Nintendo's best partners right now. Koei Tecmo is basically what would happen if Bayonetta never had that moment, never had the community realizing just how ridiculous the conspiracies and the coping about this IP actually were. You know, if Bayonetta 2's exclusivity continued to be a major controversy almost 15 years later, that's Fatal Frame. You know, that is what Nintendo is doing with this IP right now. This is a very unique situation, and it seems as if Nintendo is trying to position themselves to fully correct the situation, deal with the fans, and kind of establish Fatal Frame as their answer to Silent Hill and Resident Evil. Now, this is not what I would have done. This is not what Iwata would have done. This is clearly like a Furukawa era decision. And we've seen this kind of thing happen a couple of other times with a handful of other Nintendo exclusive IPs. Games like The Wonderful 101 were straight up traded. Batten Kaitos was released, the PC, right? It seems to be a case by case basis where like these games that are co-owned by other companies are sort of allowed to have a little bit of freedom when it comes to what platforms they release on. And I really don't necessarily think this is the best decision for Nintendo to do, but I think in this specific instance, they have dealt with the core problem of Fatal Frame specifically. The obsessive hatred that the fans had for Nintendo and everything they do and their hardware and all that. Like they dealt with the Fatal Frame fan base. What does this mean for the company as a whole? Because this kind of strategy leads credence to the idea that Nintendo will eventually release all of their games on other platforms. You know, you still see people like who still believe Bayonetta 2 and 3 are inevitably going to release on PC. Never mind that Bayonetta 2 is over a decade old at this point. You see people constantly push these ideas that Nintendo is failing and that they're on the way out. And I really dislike the idea of giving any credence to that theory, specifically the idea that Nintendo's hardware can't support a game like this, because this isn't a hardware problem. This is a demographic problem. This is an issue of the general Nintendo fan base not understanding that Fatal Frame is a Nintendo IP. It is owned by Nintendo, and the actual Fatal Frame fan base, like obsessively having this issue with the company and its image and its branding, and just genuinely not wanting to see these games succeed on Nintendo hardware. It is a very difficult situation, to be sure, and it's very much rooted in just traditional PlayStation contempt for Nintendo consoles and games. But I imagine over the next several years, as Nintendo starts introducing new Fatal Frame products and starts like involving themselves more and more with the inevitable return for this franchise, which, considering like the re-release of Fatal Frame 5, 4, and now this remake, is inevitable. I have to wonder if the Nintendo exclusive Fatal Frame 6 is right around the corner, because I have noticed that every single time one of these games gets re-released, like immediately people celebrate the fact that it's multi-plat. You know, every that is the first thing that everyone asks, is that like, is this Nintendo exclusive? And if it's not, that's when people start celebrating. So at a certain point, Nintendo is going to try to release a new exclusive Fatal Frame, and when that happens, we are going to see these people who have been celebrating these multi-plat releases like coping and seething, because they don't want to see new Fatal Frames exclusive to Nintendo hardware, and they will push back against it no matter what. I hope, much like with Fire Emblem and Kirby, that the actual fans of the series will start pushing back against this mindset. But, you know, Fire Emblem is in this position where it's been hated and ignored for over a decade now. It's been this A-list Nintendo IP for a long time, and still a significant chunk of the Nintendo audience has this weird contempt for it. And Fatal Frame is honestly in an even worse position. I cannot think of a single Nintendo IP that's in a worse position than Fatal Frame right now, because of just how obsessive the PlayStation era fans are about downplaying Nintendo's influence on the franchise. It's a very difficult situation, to be sure. It may be several decades until this IP kind of establishes itself as a mainstay Nintendo brand, a B-list franchise. But like, as it stands, this is absolutely one of the weirdest situations any Nintendo IP has been in. And I hope it recovers. I hope they figure out a way outside to fix this problem, but I don't really see any possible way they can do it. If they make it exclusive, people will see it. If they keep it multi-plat, they don't have an exclusive horror game. So again, it's a very difficult situation, and one that I hope they are able to resolve at some point. But at this stage, like, Fatal Frame really needs a kind of Fire Emblem Awakening style renaissance, where it just everything just comes together and they figure out how to kind of make this series popular and kind of sell people on the idea that they need to have a Nintendo console for it. And until that happens, like, this is something that's, I think, doomed to be a relatively niche Nintendo IP. It's possible, very possible, in fact, that Nintendo may eventually end up handing it back to Koei Tecmo. That's that's definitely a possibility at this stage. It hasn't happened yet, but it may happen in the future. So we'll have to wait and see just what this results in. I'm certainly not a Fatal Frame fan. I have played 4 and 5. I much prefer 5. But I am eagerly anticipating the release of Fatal Frame 2 remake on Nintendo Switch 2. So the simple fact of the matter that this game is getting remade and nobody is talking about it is kind of disappointing. This was one of those announcements at the direct that should have been talked about more, because back in the day, Fatal Frame 2 was acknowledged as one of the best horror games ever made and this huge classic and this like big franchise defining thing. And a remake should be just as exciting as Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil Remake 2. And the fact that it's just getting ignored really just goes to show you just how much Nintendo is going to have to struggle to make this IP relevant.